On the night of 3rd July 1976, in the old terminal district of Entebbe Airport, the air felt thick and used, 50 meters from Lake Victoria's dark shoreline. In Paris, the afternoon edition of Yedioth Ahronoth already had its standby lines set in metal. In a daring operation, the IDF rescued the passengers from the hijacked plane in Uganda. It was not yet true. In Tel Aviv, on a third-floor balcony off Ibn Gabirol Street, a Mossad case officer wiped a thumbprint from the glass of a 135mm camera lens, then turned to water a dying spider plant. The gesture too practiced to be anything but cover. On his table, a cable summarized the latest. 4 hijackers, Old Terminal, Israelis separated. By dawn, 4 C-130s would be descending toward an African runway. Some of the people in his file would survive. Some would not. The lens was finally clear. The picture would never be. On the morning of 27 June 1976, Air France Flight 139 pushed back from the gate at Ben Gurion Airport, bound for Paris via Athens. The Airbus A300's flight log recorded 246 passengers and a crew of 12. Nothing in the paperwork hinted at what would follow. In the left-hand seat, Captain Michel Bacos, a former Free French officer, ran his pre-flight checks with the muscle memory of decades: altimeters, fuel flow, hydraulic pressure. He reached forward and, out of habit, wiped a faint smudge from the cockpit windshield with a folded cloth, the same way he cleaned his sunglasses before every takeoff. Outside, families on the observation deck waved and then turned back toward parking lots, errands, and Sunday lunches. In the cabin, a 73-year-old grandmother, Dora Bloch, adjusted her seatbelt and rehearsed the English toast she planned to give at her son's wedding in New York. The flight climbed west over the Mediterranean. In Tel Aviv's Kiryat compound, a duty officer in the intelligence directorate flipped through overnight cables from Beirut and Amman, then paused to clean the dust from a telephoto lens left on the windowsill after a training exercise. For him, too, it was a routine gesture. The danger was still invisible. A straight line on a radar screen, an ordinary airliner heading for Athens. Reflection: a captain wiping a windshield, an officer wiping a lens. Both acts of maintenance, both performed in ignorance of the storm already forming around them. Before midday, 4 passengers in Athens would board with their own kind of checklist: weapons, aliases, and a flight plan that ended in Uganda. By early afternoon on 27th of June 1976, Flight 139 sat at the gate in Athens International Airport, heat shimmering off the tarmac. Airport security was notoriously lax. The records would later note that bags were barely screened and documents only briefly glanced at. 4 new passengers walked down the jetway: 2 Palestinians from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, External Operations, and 2 Germans from the Revolutionary Cells, among them Wilfried Bose and Brigitte Kuhlmann. To the cabin crew, they looked like any other travelers. One of them lifted a woman's bags into the overhead bin, smiled, and sat down. The hijackers' weapons had already passed the half-attentive security checks. 40 minutes after takeoff from Athens, Bose moved toward the cockpit, pistol in hand. According to later testimony, he announced over the intercom, under the alias Basil al-Kubaisi, that the aircraft was now under Palestinian control, and that its name was no longer Air France 139, but Haifa. In the cabin, Captain Bacos heard the words, leveled the wings, and did the one thing he could still control. He steadied his breathing and adjusted the angle of the instrument panel light. A small, precise movement to keep his world readable. In Tel Aviv, the first emergency bulletins began to print, thin paper curling out of secure teleprinters. An intelligence clerk clipped them into a file, then ran a piece of cotton over the lens of a Nikon F, preparing it for the first press conference photographs that might never be taken if this ended badly. Reflection: the Hijackers' cover life lasted less than an hour. The system that failed to see them had been failing in slow motion for years. That night, when the flight finally stopped, it was on a runway in Uganda, with Idi Amin waiting. By the morning of 28th of June 1976 in Jerusalem, the crisis was fully visible. In the Defense Ministry, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Defense Minister Shimon Peres listened as generals from the IDF and heads of intelligence walked them through the facts. An Air France jet diverted via Benghazi to Entebbe, Uganda. 248 people on board at the start, a dictator openly sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. The partners around the table spoke in the flat language of situation reports. One staff officer clicked a projector slide, a grainy aerial photograph of Entebbe's old terminal from years earlier, when Israeli advisors helped build Uganda's air force. Another slid across a memo noting Amin's repeated public praise of Palestinian freedom fighters. In a quieter office across the compound, a Mossad liaison officer reviewed the first fragments of intelligence from abroad: telephone calls, diplomatic traffic, French reports. He opened a manila envelope containing an old set of construction documents from Solel Bonnet, the Israeli firm that had built parts of Entebbe Airport, including the terminal now believed to hold the hostages. The blueprints were faded. Before pinning them to the wall, he reached for a cloth and gently cleaned the glass of the slide viewer's lens, coaxing a sharper outline of walls, doors, and narrow corridors. Every centimeter of clarity might later mean one less burst of blind gunfire. Outside, Tel Aviv went to work. Buses ran, markets opened. Children went to school. On the radio, news of the hijacking played between pop songs. The contrast between ordinary routines and the blunt numbers on the board, hostages, distance, fuel range, dug into the people now tasked with responding. Reflection: in the first 24 hours, the operation lived only as lines on paper and faint architect's ink. The human beings behind each notation still strangers to the teams trying to save them. Within 2 days, some of those strangers would walk free in Paris, carrying inside their memories the layout Mossad needed. By the mid-1970s, aircraft hijackings were no longer anomalies, but a recognized tool of political warfare. Groups such as the PFLP had turned international air routes into leverage points, while states like Uganda used their airports as stage and shield. In this climate, intelligence organizations were forced to think in 2 layers at once: the immediate problem of hostages and the larger question of what conceding, or acting, would mean for the next hijacking not yet on the radar. By 29th June 1976, in the old terminal at Entebbe, the separation was complete. Hostages' recollections, recorded later in depositions and interviews, described the moment the hijackers called people forward by name, rifles covering the room as they checked passports and surnames. Those with French, British, or other non-Israeli passports were directed to one side. Israelis and many Jews, regardless of nationality, were ordered to another hall. Survivors compared the gesture to earlier, darker selections in Europe. Writer and diplomat Yehuda Avner would later sum it up grimly: "We saw an extremist left-wing German point a finger at the hostages. Who shall go to the left and who shall go to the right? Non-Jews one way, Jews the other." The building itself was a relic. High ceilings, sweating concrete, and broken ceiling fans that barely stirred the thick equatorial air. Mossad's later reconstruction, based on blueprints and testimony, placed the main hostage hall on the ground floor. guarded by up to 7 hijackers and dozens of Ugandan soldiers. In one corner, Captain Bakos and his crew faced a choice. The hijackers told them they could leave with the released non-Jewish hostages. According to his later account, Bakos gathered his crew and said quietly, "I told my crew that we must stay until the end. We cannot accept being freed." They agreed. Night after night, the hostages lay on thin mattresses on the floor, listening to the sounds of Ugandan boots on the corridor tiles, the distant whine of aircraft engines, and the occasional laughter of soldiers outside. Light, when it came, was from fluorescent strips that flickered and buzzed. Reflection. For the hijackers, the target was a bargaining chip. For the planners in Tel Aviv, it became an architectural problem. For the people sleeping on the floor, it was just the room they might die in. When the first group of non-Israeli hostages landed in Paris on 30th June, they brought with them more than fear. They carried a mental map. On 30th June 1976, in a small office near Orly Airport in Paris, French officials and Israeli intelligence officers sat across from passengers who had just left Entebbe. The debriefing transcripts, later partially quoted in books and articles, show a blend of trauma and precision. One passenger, identified in later accounts as Ninette Morenu, had been mistakenly released as non-Jewish because of her name. She used the days in captivity to memorize the terminal's layout, door positions, distance to windows, approximate number of guards. She made a determined effort to memorize the layout. One article later noted. An Israeli intelligence officer recorded her statements in block letters. Hall, 3 exits, windows east side. Guards, Ugandan with AK-47. Terrorists, mixed rifle and pistol. Between questions, he adjusted the focus ring on a slide projector, bringing into alignment a schematic based on Solel Bonnet blueprints and the new human details the freed hostages provided. Another freed hostage, a former French soldier, described the hijackers' weapons and the way they moved, who barked orders, who seemed nervous. IDF officer Muki Betzer later recalled how Mossad passed on these details, especially the number and type of weapons, and how they became part of the assault plan's calculus. The human strain of the debriefs is visible not in the words themselves, but in their repetition. Survivors recounting over and over where children slept, where the toilets were, which corners felt darkest. With every retelling, the terminal became less abstract and more a three-dimensional problem to be solved. Reflection. The more precise the picture became, the more personal it was. A line on a map now meant a row of mattresses. A doorway meant a choke point where parents would be shielding their children. Back in Jerusalem, Rabin and Perez now had enough data to contemplate what had seemed impossible, a rescue 3,800 kilometers away. By the evening of 1st July 1976, in Rabin's office in Jerusalem, the crisis had reached its political limit. The hijackers had extended their deadline to noon on 4 July in exchange for Israel's willingness to negotiate. The cabinet now faced a binary choice: concede to the demand to free dozens of prisoners, or launch an armed operation with unknown odds of success. Historian Saul David describes a late-night meeting where Shimon Peres sat with Chief of Staff Mata Gur, his deputy Kuti Adam, Intelligence Chief Shlomo Gazit, and Air Force Commander Benny Peled. Rabin's position was clear. If no viable rescue plan emerged, Israel would have to negotiate. Around the table, officers spoke about fuel ranges, potential refueling stops, enemy air defenses, and the risk of a firefight with Ugandan troops. One cable from the Mossad station in Nairobi hinted at a possibility. Quiet cooperation from Kenya, including the use of Jomo Kenyatta International Airport for refueling. Peres pushed the military to think beyond conventional boundaries. If the IDF could not guarantee success, he argued, Israel might be forced into a public humiliation, negotiating with groups that defined themselves by hijacking and hostage-taking. The minutes are spare, but the pressure is written between the lines. Every decision carried the threat of dead civilians. Outside, in apartments across Israel, families of hostages kept televisions on without sound, listening instead to the hum of refrigerators and distant traffic. Some paced balconies, watering plants, or smoking cigarettes on autopilot, their private rituals becoming a way to outlast the waiting. Reflection. In the cabinet, the debate was framed as strategy and deterrence. In the living rooms, it was a simple, unanswered question. Will they come home? For the operation to move from paper to runway, someone else had to say yes. In Nairobi. On 2 July 1976, in Nairobi, the Mossad station was busy in a way that left little trace on paper. Later histories of Israeli intelligence note that the station in Kenya played a particularly significant role in Operation Entebbe, acting as both listening post and diplomatic spear point. Israeli officials quietly approached Kenyan Minister of Agriculture Bruce Mackenzie, a longtime contact, to ask the unthinkable: overflight clearance and refueling access for 4 Israeli Air Force C-130s and supporting aircraft. Mackenzie, who had previously supported security cooperation, took the request to President Jomo Kenyatta. Allowing the operation meant risking retaliation from Idi Amin and from Palestinian groups against Kenyans in Uganda and possibly at home. Yet Kenya eventually agreed. Intelligence reports and later CIA notes describe how the United States even contemplated ways to help protect Kenya from Ugandan retaliation in the event of an Israeli raid. Parallel to the diplomacy, Mossad rented a light aircraft in Nairobi. Posing as a civilian flight, the pilot declared an in-flight emergency and circled Entebbe, taking photographs of the airport and its approaches. An article in Air and Space Forces later noted that these images, combined with construction blueprints, gave the IDF a sharper sense of the old terminal's surroundings. Runway lights, fuel farms, possible ambush points. In the Nairobi station, as the film was developed, a case officer held each wet negative up to the light, checking sharpness before laying it on the drying rack. An assistant wiped condensation from the enlarger's lens between exposures. The motif of cleaning glass persisted, an effort to banish every blur from a mission already full of unknowns. Reflection. For Kenya, cooperation meant putting its own civilians in the crosshairs. For the Israelis, it meant that the impossible became merely improbable. With overflight and refueling secured, the operation shifted from if to how, and the Air Force began to rehearse for a landing in the dark. The Entebbe crisis unfolded only 3 years after the Yom Kippur War, when Israel had been caught strategically off guard. That shock reshaped military thinking. Surprise was no longer an enemy tactic alone, but something Israel itself might need to reclaim. Operation Entebbe would become a test case in this new doctrine, combining long-range airlift, special operations, and intelligence-driven deception in a single, high-risk move. Late on 2 July 1976, at an airbase in Sinai, engineers and soldiers worked under floodlights to assemble a rough facsimile of Entebbe's old terminal. Using Solel Bonnet blueprints and hostage testimony, they erected plywood walls, mocked up doorways, and taped lines on the tarmac to stand in for apron markings. In one corner, commandos from Sayeret Matkal, paratroopers and other units ran through assault drills with live ammunition. Their commander on the ground would be Lieutenant-Colonel Yonatan Yoni Netanyahu, a 30-year-old officer whose unit specialized in counter-terror operations. Near the runway, Colonel Joshua Shani, the lead C-130 pilot, practiced landings without runway lights at Sharm el-Sheikh. In a later interview, he recalled using early-generation night vision goggles, really primitive, and flying approaches that left senior officers breathing down my neck to see if a landing on a dark runway was even possible. Between runs, ground crews loaded a black Mercedes and 2 Land Rovers into the cavernous hold of his Hercules. The Mercedes was a rented civilian car, repainted black to resemble Idi Amin's parade vehicle. News footage had shown him arriving at the terminal in such a car, flanked by jeeps, to visit the hostages. One mechanic, working in the dim belly of the aircraft, paused to wipe grease from the lens of a loadmaster's handheld torch so it could throw a cleaner beam. In the narrow margin between overloading and stalling, every instrument, every sight line mattered. Reflection. The rehearsal could never fully match the reality in Uganda, but it gave muscle memory to men who would soon be running through live fire with civilians in their line of sight. By mid-afternoon on 3rd July, 4 C-130s lifted from Sharm's runway at weights beyond their official limits, heading south over the Red Sea at less than 100 feet above the water. The operational takeoff from Sharm el-Sheikh occurred around 15:30 on 3rd July 1976. In later accounts, Shani described the departure as one of the heaviest ever in the history of this airplane, with the lead Hercules lifting off just a few knots above stall speed and skimming meters above the water to gain airspeed and ground effect. Flying at 35 to 100 feet over the Red Sea, the 4 C-130s maintained radio silence, using the curvature of the Earth and the water's surface to mask themselves from Egyptian and Saudi radar. "Trust me, this is scary," Shani later said of reading an altimeter at 35 feet in turbulent air, in formation, at night. In the cargo bay, commandos sat on webbing seats between vehicles and stacks of equipment. The air was hot and smelled of fuel and canvas. Some soldiers, unused to the combination of turbulence and nerves, vomited into plastic bags. Weapons were checked and rechecked, optics wiped with small cloths, more out of ritual than necessity in the dim interior. After crossing into airspace where radar coverage was sparse, near Ethiopia, the formation climbed to 20,000 feet. For the first time in hours, crews could speak freely over the radio. Additional aircraft, including Boeing 707s configured for command and control and as a flying hospital, orbited farther away, listening. Somewhere over East Africa, the green glow of cockpit instruments threw ghost light on faces that would be anonymous in most official reports. Each man inside those planes carried his own quiet calculation of risk, obligation, and fear. There is little in the declassified record about their inner lives. What remains is the flight path, the fuel numbers, and a narrow band of recollection. A few recalled, silently reviewing the names of their children. Others focusing on checklists to shut those thoughts out. Reflection. From the ground, the operation would later look instantaneous. From inside the aircraft, it was 7 hours of enforced stillness before a few minutes of chaos. Near midnight, the lead Hercules dropped back to low altitude and lined up on an unlit runway at Entebbe, a landing based on radar, memory, and faith that Kenya's warning had not yet reached Amin. Shortly before midnight local time, in the first minutes of 4 July 1976, Shani's C-130 touched down on Entebbe's runway. The runway lights, contrary to some fears, were lit. Under cover of darkness, the transport taxied toward the old terminal area and dropped its rear ramp. The black Mercedes and 2 Land Rovers rolled onto the tarmac, engines rumbling. The deception plan was simple. Mimic Idi Amin's motorcade as seen on international news broadcasts, hoping Ugandan soldiers would hesitate to fire. Commandos in Ugandan uniforms sat in the vehicles, weapons concealed. As the convoy approached the terminal area, 2 Ugandan sentries stepped forward and signaled the vehicles to stop. Accounts diverged slightly on the exact sequence, but multiple sources describe Yoni Netanyahu making a split-second decision. The guards were too close, too alert. According to Ronan Bergman's Rise and Kill First, Netanyahu opened fire with a silenced pistol. When the guards did not immediately fall, another commando in the vehicle behind fired an unsuppressed rifle burst, killing them but shattering the illusion of a friendly convoy. One commando, Yiftach Reicher, later described the atmosphere on the airfield in those moments. There was total silence and total darkness, blacker than black, in the huge deserted airfield. All I thought to myself was, "Mommy, this is scary." Radio discipline remained tight. The few words spoken were clipped. Go. Forward. Left. They are not preserved in formal transcripts, but in after-action testimonies the emphasis is on how little needed to be said. Engines, gunshots, and boots on tarmac spoke louder than any full sentence. The Mercedes accelerated again, now part decoy, part battering ram. Behind it, more C-130s were already landing, disgorging additional troops and vehicles into the Ugandan night. Reflection. The carefully constructed disguise, uniforms, car, motorcade choreography, evaporated in a single rifle burst. What remained was speed, surprise, and the willingness to push deeper into harm's way after the plan's first layer had failed. Inside the old terminal, hostages lay on mattresses, half asleep, when they heard the first distant shots, and then shouts in Hebrew. At approximately 23:01 Israel time, just after midnight in Entebbe, Israeli commandos burst through the doors of the old terminal's main hall. Accounts from both soldiers and hostages converge. The first command was shouted in Hebrew and English, telling everyone to get down on the floor. The hostages' bodies hit the ground. Some tried to shield children. In the confusion, a few stood up or ran toward the soldiers, perhaps thinking they were Ugandan troops. Crossfire in those first seconds killed 3 hostages, including Jean-Jacques Maimoni and Pascal Cohen. In adjacent rooms, assault teams moved methodically, using the information from Paris debriefs to know where hijackers might be positioned. All 7 terrorists were killed in short engagements. Outside, other detachments seized the control tower and engaged Ugandan soldiers gathering near armored vehicles and aircraft. During the fighting near the terminal and on the route back to the aircraft, Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu was hit by gunfire, reportedly from a Ugandan marksman positioned near a control tower or vehicle. He was evacuated to one of the C-130s, but died of his wounds en route. He would be the only Israeli soldier killed in the raid. Meanwhile, Air Force ground teams placed explosives on Ugandan MiG-17 and MiG-21 fighters parked on the apron, destroying at least 8 and possibly up to 11 aircraft to prevent pursuit. The IDF's after-action statements list approximately 45 Ugandan soldiers killed over the course of the operation. Inside the C-130s, medics triaged wounded hostages and soldiers amid the roar of auxiliary power units. Someone wiped condensation from the lens of a medical penlight, checking pupils for reaction. The motif of cleaning glass, once about clarity and planning, was now about confirming who might live. From first touchdown to final takeoff, the raid lasted around 90 minutes. As engines powered up for departure, 102 rescued hostages, and the Air France crew lay or sat amid equipment, dazed by speed and violence, but alive. Reflection. On paper, the operation reads like a sequence of precise timings and distances. In live time, it was a blur punctuated by moments that would replay in memory for decades. A face misrecognized in the dark, a bullet's path, a brief glimpse of a commander falling. One name, however, was missing from the final manifest: Dora Bloch, taken earlier to a hospital in Kampala and left behind. In the early hours of 4th of July 1976, the rescue force landed at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport in Nairobi to refuel and treat the wounded. Kenyan cooperation, negotiated in secret days earlier, now became visible as ambulances and support vehicles approached the aircraft. Photographs and newsreels from that morning show hostages descending ramps into bright East African sunlight, surrounded by Kenyan personnel and Israeli soldiers. Some wave weakly, others clutch small bags or shoes. The Air France crew, including Captain Bakos, remain with their passengers. There was no way we were going to leave, he had insisted back in Entebbe. In Nairobi, that choice culminated in survival. In the background, C-130 engines kept turning, heat haze shimmering behind them. Ground crew checked tires and fuel lines. A flight medic cleaned the lens of a blood-smeared field ophthalmoscope before examining shrapnel injuries. The motif of wiping glass now carried a different weight. Not about reconnaissance, but about damage assessment. From Nairobi, the survivors flew on to Israel, where images of their arrival, people carried on shoulders, crowding the tarmac, quickly circled the world. Newspapers and television networks hailed a daring raid, drawing comparisons to earlier special operations missions. In Uganda, Idi Amin's response was brutal. Orders reportedly went out to retaliate against Kenyans living in Uganda. Later reports indicate that approximately 245 Kenyan Ugandans were killed and some 3,000 fled. Kenya's quiet consent, recorded only in diplomatic and intelligence files, thus carried a cost paid by people who had never heard of Flight 139. Reflection. For the hostages and their families, the story seemed to end on an airfield crowded with cameras. For Kenyans and Ugandans, Entebbe's aftermath unfolded in less visible ways, along roads, in villages, in empty houses. And in Kampala, in a hospital room at Mulago, one elderly woman's fate was still undecided, though not for long. In the days immediately after 4th of July 1976, diplomatic cables flew between London, Jerusalem, and Kampala about Dora Bloch. She had been taken from Entebbe to Mulago Hospital after choking on food during captivity. Her son, freed in the raid, had spoken with hospital staff about her condition. Shortly after the rescue, Bloch disappeared. British Foreign Office documents, declassified in 2007, conclude that she was abducted from her hospital bed by officers of the Ugandan security services and murdered on Idi Amin's orders. Her body was discovered in 1979 near the Kampala-Jinja highway by Tanzanian soldiers during the war that toppled Amin. At the United Nations, debates over the raid framed it alternately as a violation of Ugandan sovereignty and as an act of necessary self-defense against terrorism. Some delegates praised the operation's precision, others warned it set a precedent for unilateral interventions. The Security Council failed to pass a resolution condemning Israel, reflecting an unresolved tension between principles of territorial integrity and protection of civilians. Back at Entebbe, the old terminal's walls bore pocked scars from bullets. Decades later, journalists visiting the site would still photograph those scars and the rusting remains of Ugandan aircraft destroyed on the tarmac, physical archives of a night that lasted 90 minutes and reverberated for generations. In Israel, Operation Entebbe, later officially renamed Operation Yonatan, entered national memory as proof that Jewish hostages would not again be abandoned. Yehuda Avner's words captured one powerful reading. "What did we see at Entebbe?" he asked. "We saw an extremist left-wing German Nazi point a finger at the hostages. Well, now there is someone to save them." But for the men who flew and fought there, memories were more granular. Altimeter readings, the weight of gear, the smell of hydraulic fluid, the moment a door blew inward. Some later spoke of difficulty reconciling their daily civilian routines with the concentrated violence of that night. The psychological cost is less documented than the tactical success. It surfaces in brief remarks about sleeplessness, about how long they avoided airports, about the way certain engine sounds never left their ears. In one archives room in Tel Aviv, years later, a technician preparing declassified photographs of the operation for public display paused to wipe dust from a glass negative. As he lifted it to the light, the outline of a black Mercedes emerged, mid-roll, descending from the belly of a Hercules. And the gesture was routine, almost automatic, yet bound to a chain of decisions and deaths he only knew through documents. Reflection. Entebbe's story can be told as geometry and timing, as national resolve, as a morality tale of courage and terror. It can also be told as what it left behind. An empty hospital bed in Kampala, bullet chips in concrete, altered lives in Tel Aviv, Nairobi, and Entebbe. Somewhere between the cleared lens and the blurred memories, the operation remained suspended, celebrated, condemned, and, for those who were there, simply endured. In the old terminal's departure hall, long after the last hostages left and traffic patterns shifted to newer buildings, a single fluorescent tube reportedly flickered unevenly above a cracked window. Outside that window, bullet marks radiated from the frame like a frozen burst of motion. On a shelf in an Israeli archive, a contact sheet shows the same window from the other side, its image crystal clear behind a cleaned layer of glass. The lens is spotless. The glass beneath still carries the impact